The air was crisp as the first signs of autumn began to creep into the small town of Willow Creek. The leaves, once a vibrant green, were now tinged with shades of orange and red. The townsfolk were preparing for the upcoming hunting season, a tradition that had been passed down through generations. This year, like every year, a group of friends decided to embark on their annual hunting trip. But this time, the destination was different. They had chosen a place known as the Silent Woods. The Silent Woods were located about 50 miles outside of town, deep in the heart of the wilderness. The area was vast and largely unexplored, with only a few trails cutting through the dense forest. Rumors had circulated about the woods for years, stories of hunters who had ventured in but never returned, of strange sounds echoing through the trees, and of a feeling of being watched that would make even the bravest man uneasy. But these were just stories, old wives' tales told to scare newcomers. The group, consisting of 4 seasoned hunters, Jack, Mike, Tom, and Ben, brushed off the rumors as nothing more than superstition. "Nothing to worry about," Jack had said confidently as they packed their gear into the truck. "We'll be fine. Besides, it's probably just more peaceful without other hunters around." With that, they set off early on a chilly Friday morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as they drove toward their destination. The road to the Silent Woods was long and winding, the trees growing denser as they approached. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, the sky was a dull gray, and a light mist hung in the air, giving the forest an eerie, almost unnatural stillness. They parked the truck at the entrance to the woods, the last sign of civilization for miles. The plan was to hike in for a few hours, set up camp, and begin hunting the following day. The air was filled with anticipation as they hoisted their packs and rifles, ready for the adventure ahead. As they began their trek into the woods, the first thing they noticed was the silence. It was unlike anything they had experienced before. There were no birds singing, no rustling of leaves, no distant sounds of wildlife. Just silence, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The only noise came from their boots crunching on the underbrush and the occasional murmur between them. "Strange, isn't it?" Tom remarked, glancing around. "You'd think there'd be more noise." "Yeah," Ben replied, his voice low. "It's almost like something's off." "Nah, we're just not used to it," Jack said, trying to keep the mood light. "Besides, that just means the game's all ours." But as they ventured deeper, the uneasy feeling grew. The trees seemed taller, their branches gnarled and twisted, as if reaching out to ensnare anyone who dared pass by. The path, once clear, became more obscured, forcing them to navigate through thick undergrowth. The mist clung to the ground, swirling around their feet as they walked, and the silence pressed down on them, heavy and oppressive. By midday, they decided to take a break. They found a small clearing, just large enough for them to sit and rest. As they ate, the conversation was sparse, each man lost in his thoughts, casting wary glances at the trees surrounding them. "Maybe we should turn back," Mike suggested, breaking the silence. "We're pretty far in, and if the woods are as big as they say, it's easy to get lost." "Come on, Mike," Jack scoffed. "We've got GPS, maps, and compasses. We're not going to get lost. We just need to keep our heads straight." But the unease was spreading, the forest playing tricks on their minds. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if unseen eyes were following their every move. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, they found a suitable spot to set up camp. The clearing was small but sufficient, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to close in on them. They pitched their tents and started a fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trunks. The warmth of the fire was comforting, a small beacon of safety in the midst of the looming darkness. They ate in silence, the tension palpable. Even Jack, usually the most talkative, was unusually quiet, his eyes scanning the tree line. The forest around them was still silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. "Let's get some sleep," Jack finally said, his voice tight. "We've got a big day tomorrow." Reluctantly, they agreed. One by one, they retreated to their tents, the fire slowly dying down. The darkness closed in, the forest enveloping them in a blanket of pitch-black night. But sleep did not come easy. Every noise, every creak of a branch seemed amplified in the stillness. The feeling of being watched never left, gnawing at their nerves, keeping them on edge. It was as if the forest itself was alive, a silent predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The first to wake was Tom. He wasn't sure what had roused him from his restless sleep, but as he opened his eyes, he felt it immediately something was wrong. The fire had long since died, leaving the campsite in complete darkness. The air was thick, suffocating, and there was a heavy, oppressive silence. He reached for his flashlight, his hand trembling slightly as he clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of his tent. Everything seemed in order, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger. Slowly he unzipped the tent and stepped out, his flashlight casting long shadows across the ground. The campsite was eerily quiet, the trees standing like silent sentinels around him. He swung the beam of light across the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. Then he saw it movement, just at the edge of the clearing. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The beam of light trembled as he aimed it toward the source of the movement, but there was nothing there, just the thick trunks of the trees. "Guys," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. There was no response. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized he was alone. The others were nowhere to be seen. "Jack? Mike?" "Ben," he called out, louder this time, but only the silence answered him. Panic began to set in as he frantically swept the light around the clearing. The tents were empty, their flaps open and fluttering slightly in the breeze. There was no sign of the others, no indication of where they had gone. Then, from deep within the forest, he heard a low, guttural growl. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before, primal and menacing. The sound reverberated through the trees, sending a jolt of fear through him. He backed away, his heart racing, the flashlight shaking in his hand. Another growl, closer this time. The darkness seemed to close in around him, the trees looming larger, their branches reaching out like twisted claws. He could feel the presence of something watching him, something that didn't belong in the natural world. He turned and ran. The beam of light bobbed wildly as he sprinted through the woods, the underbrush tearing at his clothes and skin. The growls followed him, growing louder, closer. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away, had to escape the terror that was hunting him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning as he pushed himself to keep running. The forest was a maze, the trees all looking the same, disorienting him. The growls were right behind him now, almost at his heels. Then, without warning, he burst into another clearing. He stumbled to a stop, panting and drenched in sweat. The flashlight flickered, the battery dying, and in that brief moment of light, he saw them. Jack, Mike, and Ben were lying on the ground, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, their eyes wide open in terror. Blood pooled around them, staining the ground. It was as if they had been attacked by something savage, something inhuman. Tom's scream echoed through the silent woods as the flashlight died, plunging him into darkness. The search party found them 2 days later. The authorities had been alerted when the group didn't return on time, and a team was sent out to find them. When they reached the silent woods, they were met with an eerie silence that unsettled even the most experienced searchers. It didn't take long to find the camp. The tents were still standing, untouched, but the clearing where Tom had stumbled into told a different story. The bodies of Jack, Mike, and Ben were discovered, just as Tom had seen them, their deaths brutal and unexplained. But Tom was nowhere to be found. The search continued for days, but there was no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The official report ruled it as an animal attack, though the details were vague and the wounds on the bodies didn't match any known predator. The case was quietly closed, and the silent woods were once again left undisturbed. But those who knew the story, who had heard the rumors and the whispers, knew better. They knew that the silent woods were not a place to be trifled with, that there was something out there in the darkness, something that watched and waited. And every year, as the leaves began to turn and the hunters prepared for their season, the story of the silent woods was told, a cautionary tale for those who thought themselves invincible. Because in the silent woods, the silence was not just an absence of sound. It was a warning, a harbinger of the horrors that lurked within. It was the kind of crisp autumn day that should have been perfect for hunting. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dense forest that stretched for miles. The leaves, painted in hues of amber and crimson, crunched underfoot as Gerald Thompson made his way deeper into the woods. The small town of Cedar Hollow was miles behind him, the distant hum of life replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Gerald was a seasoned hunter, known for his skill and patience. Every fall, he took a week off work, packed his gear, and disappeared into the wilderness. It was his ritual, a way to escape the grind of his day-to-day life. This year, he had set his sights on something bigger, a trophy buck he had spotted on his trail camera a few weeks earlier. The locals called it the ghost, a massive deer with antlers so wide they seemed to stretch the span of a man's outstretched arms. Gerald had become obsessed with the idea of bringing it down. He walked for hours, his senses attuned to every sound. The forest was alive with the quiet noises of wildlife, but there was something off this time. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather crawled up his spine as he ventured deeper. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as if the trees were closing in on him. But he shook off the unease, attributing it to nerves. After all, the hunt was always a mix of excitement and fear. As the day wore on, Gerald found a good spot to set up his camp. He pitched his tent in a small clearing, a flat piece of ground surrounded by towering pines. The sun was setting, casting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange. He built a small fire, the crackling flames offering warmth and light in the encroaching darkness. He ate a simple meal of beans and jerky, washing it down with a swig of whiskey from his flask. As the fire died down, Gerald unrolled his sleeping bag and lay down, staring up at the canopy of stars visible through the gaps in the trees. He felt the familiar sense of peace that came with being out here, away from everything. But just as he was about to drift off, he heard a faint rustling in the underbrush, too heavy to be a small animal. He sat up, suddenly alert, listening intently. The noise stopped as quickly as it had begun. He waited, holding his breath, but the silence stretched on. Eventually, he convinced himself it was nothing more than a deer or perhaps a raccoon and lay back down, though sleep was now elusive. The next morning, Gerald was up before dawn. The sky was still dark as he packed up his gear and set out, determined to track down the ghost. He followed the trails he knew well, moving quietly, every step calculated. The air was crisp, his breath visible in the cold morning light. The world around him was eerily silent, the usual sounds of the forest muted. As the hours passed, he saw signs: hoof prints, tufts of fur caught on branches, fresh droppings. The ghost was close. His pulse quickened, the thrill of the hunt washing over him. But the deeper he went, the more that feeling of unease from the previous night returned, stronger now, gnawing at the edges of his mind. By midday, he had reached the far edge of the forest, a place he had only been once before. The trees were older here, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches intertwined to form a dense canopy that blocked out much of the light. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks. It was difficult to navigate, but Gerald pushed on, driven by the thought of the ghost. And then he saw a flash of movement in the distance, too quick to make out clearly, but unmistakably the ghost. He paused, heart pounding, as he adjusted his rifle, carefully sighting down the barrel. He took a step forward, and that's when he noticed a sound, soft but distinct, coming from behind him. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The forest was still. His senses on high alert, he began to move again, this time more cautiously. But the sound persisted, a faint rustling, like something or someone was following him. He spun around again, but there was no one, just the endless expanse of trees. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being watched was too strong to ignore. As he continued, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, no longer just an occasional rustle but the distinct sound of footsteps, matching his own. Gerald stopped, his breath catching in his throat, and for a moment the forest was silent again. But then, the footsteps continued, moving closer, faster. Panic began to set in. He swung his rifle around, ready to fire at whatever was stalking him, but there was nothing to shoot at. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it a bear? A wolf? But no animal he knew moved like that, so deliberately, so calculated. Without warning, a figure burst out of the underbrush to his left, moving with terrifying speed. Gerald barely had time to react. He swung his rifle up, but the figure was on him in an instant, tackling him to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and his rifle was wrenched from his hands, skidding across the forest floor. He struggled, adrenaline flooding his system as he fought to throw off his attacker. But the figure was strong, pinning him down with ease. Gerald caught a glimpse of his assailant, a man, dressed in camouflage, his face smeared with mud and grime, eyes wild and furious. The man didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just grinned a horrible, twisted smile that sent a jolt of terror through Gerald. He realized, with sickening clarity, that this was no accident. This man was hunting him. The realization hit Gerald like a freight train. He was the prey, not the hunter. The man straddling him had all the power, and there was no reasoning with him, no pleading for mercy. In the predator's eyes, Gerald saw something primal, something feral. This was a game, and Gerald was the prize. With a surge of strength born of desperation, Gerald bucked against the man, throwing him off balance. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest, and lunged for his rifle. But the man was quicker, kicking the rifle away before Gerald could reach it. The man pulled out a knife, its blade glinting in the dim light filtering through the trees. Gerald's survival instincts kicked in. He backed away, keeping his eyes locked on the man. The forest that had once felt so familiar now seemed like a labyrinth, every tree a potential hiding place for more dangers. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to survive. The man advanced, his steps slow and deliberate, savoring the fear he saw in Gerald's eyes. Gerald knew he had to act fast. He couldn't win in a straight fight. The man was too strong, too skilled. But Gerald had spent years in these woods. He knew them like the back of his hand. If he could just create some distance, he might have a chance. With a sudden burst of speed, Gerald turned and bolted into the forest. He heard the man curse behind him, the sound of footsteps pounding after him. Branches whipped at his face, thorns tore at his clothes, but he didn't stop. He could hear the man gaining on him, but he didn't dare look back. He ran blindly, driven by pure instinct. He could hear the man crashing through the underbrush behind him, closer now, almost on him. Gerald veered sharply to the left, hoping to throw the man off, but the footsteps followed, relentless. And then he saw it, a narrow ravine, hidden by undergrowth, a sheer drop into darkness. It was too late to stop. Gerald threw himself forward, twisting his body as he fell. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding in his side as he tumbled down the slope, branches and rocks tearing at him as he went. He came to a stop at the bottom, gasping for breath, his body screaming in pain. He could taste blood in his mouth, but he forced himself to move, crawling behind a large boulder, trying to make himself as small as possible. He heard the man at the top of the ravine, cursing and shouting. The sound of footsteps grew louder as the man searched for a way down. Gerald held his breath, trying to control the panic rising in his chest. He couldn't outrun him, he knew that now. But he could hide, at least for a little while. The man reached the bottom of the ravine, his breathing heavy with exertion. Gerald could see him from his hiding spot, the man's eyes scanning the area, searching for any sign of movement. Gerald stayed perfectly still, praying the man wouldn't find him. But luck wasn't on his side. The man's gaze landed on the boulder, and Gerald knew he had been spotted. The man grinned, that same twisted smile, and started toward him, knife in hand. Gerald's mind raced. He needed a weapon, anything to defend himself. His eyes darted around, and then he saw it, a sharp piece of rock, jagged and heavy, lying just within reach. He lunged for it, grabbing it as the man closed in. The man was almost on him, raising the knife for the final blow. But Gerald was faster. With every ounce of strength he had left, he swung the rock at the man's head. The impact was sickening, the sound of bone cracking echoing through the ravine. The man staggered, a look of shock and pain crossing his face before he collapsed to the ground, the knife falling from his hand. Gerald didn't stop. He brought the rock down again and again, his vision red with fury and fear, until the man lay still, his body broken and lifeless. For a long moment, Gerald just stood there, his chest heaving, the rock still clutched in his hand. The reality of what he had done slowly sank in. He had survived, but the cost was more than he had ever imagined. He dropped the rock, his hands trembling. Blood, both his and the man's, stained his clothes, his skin. The man's body lay in a crumpled heap at his feet, a grotesque reminder of the violence that had just taken place. Gerald knew he couldn't stay here. He had to get out of the woods, back to civilization, back to safety. But the forest that had once been his refuge now felt like a prison, every shadow hiding potential danger. He forced himself to move, to climb back up the ravine, each step a painful reminder of the fight he had just endured. His body ached, his mind numb from the shock, but he kept going, driven by the need to escape. It took hours, but eventually he made it back to his camp. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the clearing. He didn't bother with the tent or the fire, he just grabbed his pack and started walking, not stopping until he reached the edge of the forest. The sight of his truck was a relief so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He climbed in, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys, and drove away, leaving the forest and the horrors within it far behind. As the miles passed, Gerald tried to process what had happened, but the events of the day were too surreal, too nightmarish. He had come to the forest to hunt, but instead he had been hunted, pushed to the brink of his endurance, forced to kill to survive. The ghost was forgotten, just a distant memory now. Gerald knew he would never return to these woods. The place that had once brought him peace was now tainted with blood and fear. He had survived, but he was no longer the same man who had entered the forest that morning. The hunter had become the hunted, and the scars of that day would stay with him forever.